In the far reaches of Angermanland, where dense forests pressed close to the villages and the wind carried the scent of pine and snow, the parish of Torsåker lived as it had for generations, bound by piety, superstition, and the rigid hand of the church. In 1675, life in this northern expanse was harsh. Winter's frost lingered longer than it should, crops failed, and death was an intimate companion. Children learned to respect the silence of the woods. Mothers spoke in hushed prayers, and fathers bore the weight of unseen sins, believing every hardship was punishment for some hidden crime. It began with whispers. Mothers muttered that the devil walked in the village, leaving marks upon the innocent. Farmers spoke of strange figures glimpsed at the forest's edge, always vanished when approached. Animals went missing. Livestock lay dead, eyes wide in terror. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across frozen fields, and the local priest, a man of stern doctrine and unquestioned authority, declared that the devil had taken root among them. The accusations were slow at first, subtle. A girl accused of speaking in tongues. A woman charged with using charms to make crops fail. A neighbor insisting that another had bewitched the river so the fish would not bite. Each claim, dismissed by some, was taken with solemnity by others. Fear had woven itself into every conversation, every glance. And in Torsåker, where faith and fear were inseparable, the seeds of disaster were already sown. It was the morning that they found the first body that panic fully bloomed. The child, no older than 7, was discovered in a frozen field, eyes wide, lips blue, and hands clenched as if gripping some invisible horror. The priest, his robes flapping in the cold wind, pronounced the child a victim of witchcraft, the devil's malice made flesh. The villagers, already tense, trembled at his words, for in these times, accusation was as deadly as evidence. The church council convened, a circle of stern faces illuminated by the dim light of candles. It was decided that the parish would root out the evil within its midst. The inquisitors were local men, devout and unyielding, armed with the authority of God and the unwavering belief that their task was righteous. They sought out the accused, one by one, questioning, observing, and compelling confession. Fear was the instrument. Guilt was irrelevant. By the spring of 1675, the village had been transformed into a theater of terror. Families were torn apart in the name of salvation. Children, some barely old enough to walk, were accused alongside their mothers and fathers. Mothers who had held their children close in whispered prayers now found them torn from their arms, brought before the council of the righteous. The inquisitors demanded confession. Many complied simply to end the questioning, though words spoken under duress held little truth. The cruelest aspect of the Torsåker trials was the indiscriminate nature of accusation. Age, gender, or innocence offered no shield. The inquisitors moved through the parish like shadows, silent yet omnipresent. Every home was searched. Every word could condemn a family. Those who resisted were subjected to interrogation designed to break the will. Some say that the master of the court, the priest who led the inquisitors, kept a ledger of sins and names, each a mark toward death, and that his eyes gleamed with the certainty of God's wrath as he crossed names from the page. Children were among the first to be condemned, not spared for their innocence, but instead made examples of. They were brought into the church, placed upon the cold stone floors, and interrogated until their voices trembled and their bodies shook. Their confessions, often garbled and confused, were recorded meticulously, each word twisted into proof of infernal influence. Mothers wept. Fathers prayed silently for mercy that would not come. Some villagers whispered that the children had glimpsed demons in the night, unseen by any adult, that whispered in a language no human should understand. As the spring thawed the frozen ground, the executions began. Those found guilty were brought to the forest beyond the village, where the snow had melted into mud, and the smell of earth and rot filled the air. They were hanged, burned, or both. Witnesses say that the air carried the sound of screams for miles, and yet none dared intervene. For in Torsåker, the righteous hand of the church was law, and the devil's work was assumed in every gesture of fear or hesitation. The killings were not swift. The inquisitors believed that the torment of the guilty, the prolonged suffering, was part of salvation. Children, mothers, fathers, even the elderly were brought to the gallows or the pyre. Some resisted with defiance. Others prayed for mercy that never came. Their cries mingled with the wind, echoing off the trees and across the frozen fields. Villagers who watched were struck dumb, some weeping openly, others frozen in silent horror. It was a lesson, the inquisitors said, to cleanse the parish of sin. There were rumors, of course, whispered by those who survived, that some of the executed were innocent, that the real evil lurked not in the bodies of the accused but in the hearts of the accusers, that the children's terrified confessions were nothing more than echoes of adult fear, magnified into horrors that could justify death. Yet these whispers were dangerous. To speak against the process was to invite suspicion, and suspicion in Torsåker in 1675 was as deadly as the axe or the rope. The forest itself seemed to respond to the horror. Animals fled. Wolves, which had always skirted the village, were seen prowling closer to homes. At night, villagers swore that shadows moved where there should be none. Children spoke of figures standing at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. Those who remained in their homes at night reported hearing whispers in languages they did not know, voices repeating the words of their own confessions, mocking them. Some say these were the spirits of the executed, returned to haunt the living, a chorus of suffering that would not end. By midsummer, the parish of Torsåker was a village hollowed by fear. Over 70 people had been killed, nearly every household touched by grief. Fields lay untended, livestock dwindled. The sound of mourning, once private and solemn, became a constant dirge that filled every corner of the village. The inquisitors moved on eventually, but their work left a scar deeper than any wound the living could heal. Families were destroyed, and trust had been stripped from the people as completely as their neighbors' lives had been stripped from them. The survivors carried the memory of the killings in every glance, every gesture. Some abandoned the village entirely, unable to bear the reminders of horror that lingered in every street, every home, every forest edge. Others stayed, driven by the stubbornness of kinship, or by poverty, or by the hope that time might soften the edges of memory. But time did little to dull the terror. The children who survived were haunted by nightmares. Mothers wept for children who would never return. Fathers could not speak of the loss without trembling. And in the stillness of the forests, the wind seemed always to whisper their names. For decades, the Torsåker Murders became legend, a cautionary tale of fear unbridled by reason, of the terrible power of those who claimed the right to judge sin. Scholars later wrote of the event, noting its extreme brutality, its indiscriminate killings, and the psychological terror inflicted upon an entire parish. Yet in Torsåker itself, the story lived not in books but in memory, in the lingering fear in the shadows, in the way the trees seemed to lean closer to the village in winter, and in the cries of children echoing in the imagination of every survivor. Even centuries later, visitors to the parish speak of an unease that never fully lifts. The forests are dark and oppressive. The old church stands silent, its walls echoing with prayers long forgotten. And some swear that in the dead of night, when the wind whistles through the branches, the voices of those 70 souls, children, parents, innocents and guilty alike, rise once more, a choir of sorrow, warning all who enter of the fragile line between fear and justice, between the living and the dead, and the horrors that men can inflict when guided by unyielding zeal. Torsåker, in the end, became more than a village. It was a monument to the cruelty of humanity when fear is weaponized, a testament to innocence destroyed, and a chilling reminder that history is not always written by the victors, but sometimes by the echoes of the silenced, whose suffering reaches across the centuries, whispering from the shadows of the past. Even today, some locals claim that walking the fields near Torsåker after dusk is perilous. The air is heavy, the night alive with unseen eyes. Some hear the sound of children laughing and crying at once, a sound that should never exist together. Some feel a touch upon their shoulder, warm, yet empty of form, and the wind, carrying the memory of blood and fear, seems to murmur a single lesson. Vigilance, yes, but above all, mercy. For history remembers both those who punish and those who suffer, and the cries of the latter can never be silenced.